I would give anything to be able to get so close to an answer that it would happen for everybody.
It's time for the Share Recovery Podcast, where we bring you amazing life-changing success stories from addicts and alcoholics all over the world who share their inspiring journey in recovery. And now, here's your host, O.
On today's episode of the Share Podcast, we're going to have David Chaloner joining us. He's the author of Ask, the Addiction Survival Kit. And David also has an amazing story. He shares with us today his own battle with alcoholism and drug abuse, and he also has 28 years clean with an extensive background in recovery and addiction. But first, some Share Podcast news. Coming very soon, Sober Nation is going to have a section entirely devoted to podcasts. I think we can all agree that that's some pretty exciting stuff. And the podcasts that you will find in there are The Recovery Elevator, That Sober Guy, WWA, Wrestling with Addiction, a new one, with Gabriel Miller, and of course, yours truly, the Share Podcast. So be sure to look out for that coming soon on Sober Nation. On other news, we have also started a panel discussion which we don't have a set date on when and how often we're going to be doing them, but we are looking for listener feedback. On the right-hand side of the website, sharepodcast.com, you will see a Leave Us a Voicemail Message button. Just click on that button and leave us a question or a topic that you would like us to discuss on the panel meeting. For those of you that heard it, that was Rule 62, Episode 4. It was entitled, Why Did You Get Sober? And that panel discussion included Paul Churchill from The Recovery Elevator, Shane Raymer from That Sober Guy, and Michael Hilton from the UK. We will be doing another panel discussion, so make sure to leave us a topic or a question you would like us to discuss. And for those of you who would like to share your story in written form or write an article in regards to addiction, recovery, sobriety, other addictions, whatever it is that you feel that you would like to write about or have already written about and would like to share it to the world, then we are going to be starting a blog on the Share Podcast. And on that blog will be articles written by our listeners. So email me your story or your article at o@thesharepodcast.com. And now a message from our sponsor. Sober Nation is the largest online recovery community and treatment resource center. They provide treatment resources to those struggling with addiction, as well as to the family members who are caught in the crossfire. On top of that, Sober Nation is a huge community of good people who share their experience with each other. They have informative content, recovery and addiction news, as well as an entire clothing line which helps expand the culture of recovery. They can easily be found at www.sobernation.com. Sober Nation is putting recovery on the map. And after this interview, if you enjoyed listening to the Share Podcast, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or Stitcher Radio. This will ensure we get ranked well on these networks, and that means more people will easily find the Share Podcast. This is the best way to show your support and help us grow. And finally, if you would like to make a donation to the Share Podcast, you can do so using PayPal. On the top right corner of the website, you'll see a donate button. Just click on it, and this will take you to the page where you can make your donation. Thanks again for helping the Share Podcast become a huge success. Now back to the show. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. And how are you, O?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling very good indeed, actually. I'm in sunny Auckland, New Zealand, and I've just been doing some good work with some clients who are on a journey of seeking new ways of being, and that's where I live.
I love it. So, David, let's dive right in. Tell us about how your life is today, your hobbies, your exercise. Take us into your normal daily routine, including recovery, and tell us a little bit about the Addiction Survival Kit.
It's there and it's available, and it's a very it's had good reviews, and it took me a long time to write it, and I've been working in the field for 7 years now, and it's a synthesis of what I have learned about the addictions world. It's interesting, and it's a very easy read, so I recommend it as someone who's read thousands of textbooks and studied and done all sorts of things. I think for someone who simply wants to trying to find a way to understand the apparent insanity of addiction, I believe I do it in a way that is honest and understandable and simple. What drove me was that it should be capable of being opened at any page by anyone. So I wanted it to be as broadly informative as it could possibly be, not only to someone who might have a problem, but also to someone, and there are 2 or 3 times as many of those in the world, someone who is being affected by somebody else's addiction, a partner, a family member, an employer. So it's a book which just tries to say, look, this is the insanity of addiction set out in a way which is hopefully can be understood, capability to understand the paradoxes, to understand that if you want to understand an addict, don't think rationally, because that just gets you into more trouble. Because it's like if you were to speak in your native tongue and I was to speak in a broad Scottish brogue, neither of us would understand each other.
I can believe. Yeah, I'm following you.
Yeah, that's what happens in this. That the person with the problem has a completely different mindset and an understanding of who and what they are in relation to the drug or the behavior, to the person who is trying to get them to see that there's a problem. And all the old finger wagging and threats and withdrawal of love and trying to get people to see in that sense are largely unproductive. And there's a bigger question as well, which I only hint at in that little book. It's only 13,000 words or so, because I found that every time I started to write in the old way, I started to write a textbook, of which there are thousands.
Right.
Literally thousands. I remember walking into Barnes & Noble in San Francisco and thinking, I'll just go and have a look at the addiction section, see what's going on. And my mouth just dropped open. I was like a boy from the country looking at thousands upon thousands of titles. And I thought, how can I write anything which is going to help make a difference or even be noticed? And that latter thing is always problematic, and be noticed. But I thought, well, at least if I write it in a different way, maybe it'll add something to what is out there. And generally speaking, those people who have sought it out or have read it have written very kind reviews supporting my logic. And so I'm happy with that. My life today is one of continuing expansion and exploration. I turned 65 on Sunday, and that's almost surreal because subjectively, as I know it is for many people, I only feel 35, 40. But maybe some of my friends would also suggest I'm pretty immature at times too. So that's part of it. But I feel good. I broke my ankle recently, but that was because I was out hiking, and I spend as much time in the outdoors as I can, and it's fixed now. I love walking. I adore listening to blues and classical music of various kinds. For American audiences, my love of the blues goes right back to the earliest forms, from Robert Johnson through Memphis and then into the Chicago styles. And I have a great love of Copeland and others of that ilk. I think you have a wonderful musical tradition. I don't read as much as I used to. My focus on reading is now far more specific. I'm only interested if there is what I would call, and sometimes it's rather pretentious to say so, but it's of a spiritual dimension. The work of the Christian mystical tradition, or people like Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating, Francis Rohr, the Franciscan mystic who works out of New Mexico, the early desert fathers and desert mothers from the 4th and the 5th century. I really don't attach myself to any kind of religious persuasion. I'm as happy reading Buddhist literature and Taoist, but I'm a north of England boy taught by Roman Catholics, and that's my tradition, the Christian mystical tradition, and that underpins my life and my work today as much as my ego and the pressures of day-to-day life will allow me. So I start each day with prayer and meditation. I will walk, I will eat, and then I will work with people who, wherever they are in the world, on Skype, for example. I have rooms both in England and New Zealand. I will never see more than 20 or so clients a week, but those 20 clients, when I'm with them, get my entire attention. I have in the past worked with groups in rehabs and various sort of government-sponsored addiction centres, but I prefer to work on my own in private one-to-one, so I don't have to think about whether something fits the requirements of a health board or a licentiate system. There are 1,000 ways of working that are effective. The key is to find the way of working that fits you, the person in the room saying, hey, I'm trapped in this and I can't get out. And my job is to help them find a way through themselves, which allows them to walk through a door which takes them out to an expansive world rather than the limiting, trapped, damaged, painful world of the full-blown addict. And one of the great excitements and great challenges is there's no way of knowing who will find a way through. I can't sit here and say, come and see me, I'll find a way through for you, because no one's ever found the way. Various aspects of the medical profession and the psychology industry have said this and this and this are the only sensible ways, but they're not. There's a lot of evidence-based practice that really is confirmation bias on the part of the therapists, and there's a lot of practice-based evidence that gets ignored because it works. And the key is the experience to allow that to happen. And so I very much come from that tradition of I'm not so much interested in what people say should be. I'm only interested in how do we find a way through for you. And for some people, they become born again in some way, or they find that grasping some cognitive tools in terms of managing their thinking is the way. For other people, they need to go into a deep psychotherapeutic evaluation of their whole lives before they can scrape away the layers of harm that have been done, which have made an addictive process a kind of self-medication. The key is to be open to everything and to judge no one. That is, if I have a gift, it is that I judge no one. For obvious reasons, I'm one myself. And I did things when I was drinking and using that I'm by no means proud of. In fact, that's an understatement. And if people need judging, it's other people. But we, as a society, we spend too much time trying to persuade people to do something based around punitive actions. And one of my experiences working with addicts is that they are amongst the toughest people on the planet. And so wagging a finger at them, you get resistance immediately. Yeah. And of course, they're not thinking rationally, so they find themselves in arguments with the law, which of course, as the song goes, I fought the law and the law won. And that's the way it is. But the addict is not being treated. They're just being warehoused. And as you've discovered and has found all around the world, that is serving nobody except, sadly, the private prisons where the punishment of people makes profit for others. And I find that a very sad thing when the reality is we're talking about a health issue.
Right.
And I know I could hear people jumping up and down all over the universe wanting to argue with me.
No, I don't think so. Just listening to you, there's a lot of information here that's going right over my head. Even when you were talking about the jazz musicians, I was sitting, man, I'm going to have to Google all this. I'm from the United States, and I don't recognize any of those. So regardless of how much information I actually know, the reality is that I get it. And for most of us that are in recovery, or at least have found the rooms of recovery, that feeling of not being judged is so important for the newcomers when they come in, which is what I wanted to ask you as well, which is, after 28 years of being clean and sober, what's your recovery routine?
My recovery routine has only changed in the intensity of my attendance to certain kinds of groups. I now I'm more flexible, and I can have those conversations on the phone and in my room with people who are like-minded, but I maintain contact with those people. But I'm a great believer in the anonymity of those projects for a variety of reasons. I have come to believe that the power greater than myself is in fact within the Christian mystical tradition, my I am presence, the God of my understanding, who inhabits me and I inhabit, and that everything I do is a reflection of that which placed me on this earth, and that everybody I speak to and look at and looks back at me is a reflection of that God. And so I have a duty to treat everybody. The great mystic Thomas Merton once wrote that, and funnily enough, he was American with a Kiwi and New Zealand father, so I didn't know that. And that sort of made me feel good. But he said that if we understood the extent to which the divine exists in every person, we would spend our time on our knees worshipping each other.
That's awesome.
I love that.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And if we respected each other that much, we would be able to see a problem developing and be able to find a compassionate way of finding a way through. So that underpins everything I do. For what saved my life 28 years ago was being maneuvered into a residential rehab in the South Island of New Zealand. It's long gone now because of politics and money.
Right.
But it worked brilliantly. It certainly worked for me.
So then you do go to regular meetings still after 28 years?
Yeah, the regularity might be a little bit because I travel around quite a lot more than I do, but I never forget that I have to touch base.
Beautiful.
With that, if you know what I mean.
Yes, and that's exactly the purpose of the podcast, is not just to tell somebody's story, but it's also to have that ability to relate with everyone that you listen to, and to understand that no matter how much time you have to stay close to your foundation and your roots, which is whatever fellowship you choose to be a part of, that you maintain that recovery foundation and also that conscious contact with a higher power, which you also have. That is it's such a key to maintaining, your recovery.
And I'd be a bit more radical for someone, if there's someone listening who has struggled with finding a recovery and has resisted, for example, 12-step fellowships because they don't believe in God and they've heard all kinds of stories about being cult, which are patently nonsense, to explore them. Don't write something off until you've actually explored it properly, because it is contrary to, because addictions are so governed in society by shame and fear and threat, to actually apparently publicly say I am an alcoholic and a drug addict is terrifying to a lot of people who may have standing in their communities, who may not understand that in fact is one of the most powerful statements in the world to say. Absolute nonsense that people talk about, if you label yourself as something, you're minimizing. I was trapped in a narrow world which created nothing but pain for myself and those members of my family around me, and was destroying me physically, emotionally, psychologically, and in career. And when I broke out of that and I was able to say, yeah, I am an alcoholic and I am a drug addict, and it was necessary for me to find the humility to perhaps explore something beyond myself in this crazy free world of AA and NA and GA and CA and so on, and that all those things blossomed as a result of my putting down my ego and allowing myself to be humble enough to allow people to see me as I really and truly was. It was the foundation for my recovery and has never changed. When somebody comes in my room, they will not know for a very long time that I have that background. I don't force anything on anybody, but I will at some point. If I believe that person may well benefit, I will say, have you tried AA? Have you tried NA? And if they haven't, I'll say, well, let's look at the reasons why you avoid it. What's going on? And I have in the past, and some would say that this is a boundary violation for a counsellor, but I have gone with somebody and taken them to their meeting, the first meeting, so they don't feel fearful. I'll hand them over and go and get a coffee. I'll talk to them later.
You know what? I think culturally, it depends on where you are in the world as far as anonymity goes, because in the United States, my opinion is that it's become a lot more open and a lot more welcoming to discuss being an alcoholic, being an addict, and seeking recovery now doesn't wear a veil of shame anymore. And I'm not sure in every single culture, because I live in Costa Rica, and here there's still a stigma, and there's still, for some upper echelon individuals, that would be considered a veil of shame to consider yourself or to admit that you're an alcoholic or an addict, and not just to be able to, well, you know what, you should have more self-control. You should be more responsible, without any sort of understanding of what it is to be or to have this disease. So anyway, listen, David, I want to jump into your story. But first, how much clean time do you have exactly, and when is your anniversary date?
My anniversary date is on November the 24th, next month that is. I will be 28 years clean from alcohol and any other mood-altering, mind-changing chemicals. And 18 years ago, I gave up smoking cigarettes as well.
18 years ago?
I kept that one going for a while. I had a lot of good justifications for that one. But I used to do these amazing groups in rehab, and then we'd all go and sit outside and smoke cigarettes and tell ourselves how good we were. And
I love it.
But I eventually, and courtesy, I might say, of a lovely American man who was the program manager. He came to New Zealand. George was a wonderful fellow, and he was the one who maneuvered us into confronting our behavior with tobacco, and I'm very grateful to the man.
That's wonderful.
That's 28 years.
Beautiful. All right. So, David, listen, we're all warmed up here. We've got a wonderful idea of who David is today and the impact that you have on your clients and in the recovery community. But now I want you to tell us your story, the battle you had against drugs and alcohol, the wreckage it caused in your life, when it hit rock bottom, and then finally your journey into recovery up until today. Well, up until you got clean, because that's 28 years.
1987. That's in some ways it's extremely simple. It's like so many stories of recovery. The similarities that I share with so many are so evident. There are minor differences. I came from a very hard-working north of England Roman Catholic family, eldest of 6 children. I was the apple of my family's eye. I was destined for great things. I had a good mind. And there were a lot of issues. My beloved father was in the Second World War. I was born in 1950, so it wasn't that long after. And the England I was born into was a very impoverished and battered country after the World War II. And in fact, I grew up in Manchester, and I hadn't really taken any notice, but I grew up playing amongst old bomb sites. That was my childhood, in a big city that had been largely flattened by blitzes in the war. And I grew up and went to school, and I say a lot of this with my PhD in hindsight, which of course everybody has. But I was a very sensitive child. I reacted. I was perfectionist in my behaviors. If I didn't think I would do well, I would avoid it. I was not famous for trying very hard, so I was either very, very good at what I did, or was appalling, which caused confusion in the school world that I inhabited. I went to university and initially went to read law, and actually the only thing I did in that year was become captain of the university drinking team.
Outstanding.
So that kind of gives you where I got to there. And from then on, from that point was probably about 18 years of continuing demoralizing failure to reach what I was capable of. I got good jobs. I eventually got a degree, and I couldn't have told you much about it. I had good jobs, which I never stayed in. I've always moved on. I was always drinking. I never had any money. Everything was a struggle, and it continued. I had depression, which I now know actually was something which was within my family. So I was putting a depressant on depression. So I became a danger to myself. I married and had two beautiful children. And I can tell you, today I can do it without feeling tearful. But when my babies were babies, I could not have identified them in an identity lineup because I was permanently drunk to all intents and purposes. And that's a reality. And now they are, 30 and 32 and effective, purposeful, dynamic individuals. And largely that was because I managed to be maneuvered into rehab, having really just been a catastrophic. I was the kind of drunk who often people didn't know that I was a drunk. I would go and hide and drink. But I remember that I would come home at 4 or 5 in the morning. I would wet myself in things. I remember coming home, having damaged my car to a stage almost of write-off, and I couldn't tell you. And even today, I often wait for that memory to come back. I wrecked my car so badly, so something got ruined on the way through, somebody else. And I have no idea. I really have no idea. And I found myself maneuvered into this residential rehab by a deeply concerned and very angry and frustrated wife and my dear sister who was living out here by then. And I found myself in this rehab in the South Island of New Zealand at Hanna Springs. And I arrived there knowing that I had no idea, this is how far off base I was. I didn't know it was an addictions clinic. I knew it was a place where you kind of went for a rest and tried to pull yourself together, and that's the only thing I knew. And it was in the wilds of the mountains of South Island. And this nurse introduced me and put me in this little room and said, we'll be meeting for afternoon tea, have a little rest after your long trip. And there were 2 books beside the bed. And one was, as I now know, was the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I looked at and very specifically avoided. I picked up another book by, as it turned out, the head of that treatment center, who was a psychiatrist called Robert Crawford. And he'd written a book called But I'm Only a Social Drinker. And there's a little paperback, and I picked it up. And I don't know whether you and people, I'm sure you will. You know when you read a magazine and there are these quizzes that you can do to find out whether you really should be a track star or a fashionista or a writer or things like this, and you answer these questions.
Right.
And what I used to do, of course, when answering was find out what mark I needed to get, what sort of numbers I needed to get to get the top thing. And I didn't do this on this occasion. There were 20 questions, and the 20 questions, it just said, answer these as honestly as you can. And I thought, okay. And for once in my life, I did that. I went through them, and the 20 questions, I answered yes to every one. And I turned the page, and it said, if you answered yes to 3 or more, you have a serious problem with alcohol.
Wow.
I'd answered yes to all 20, so not even my shifty, manipulative mind could maneuver questions back to get me back to just less than 3. I was landed with this, and I excuse the profanity, but I sat there, and a voice inside, my inner voice that we all have, I was lying on this bed looking at this result, and inside it said, Christ, I'm an alcoholic. And it was that realization, which I then fought, because I'd been brought up to stand up for myself, to fight, to use my will to overcome problems, and all of those things. And so to try and admit that I was powerless over my addiction was a huge leap. It was one thing to realize it; the other thing was to make it actual in my life. And so I got through treatment, refusing to go to Alcoholics Anonymous because that was one of the offerings that you went to meetings.
Of course.
And when eventually I did, I went very unwillingly one night when someone dug at me and said, winners go to meetings, or such trite nonsense, you know. And I went, and I walked into this little hall in the middle of nowhere, which was full of, as it turns out, these recovering alcoholics. And it was back in the days when you could smoke in public. And the smoke in this room was so dense you could walk on it just about. But the thing that happened was I never heard a thing. But as I walked through the door, I walked into a feeling, a sensation of being at home. And from that point, in that sense, I never looked back. I still tried to prove to myself I could control my drinking. And over the course of the months, I left treatment in the March of that year, having spent 12 weeks there, knowing that I was an alcoholic, having been given all these wonderful tools and the opportunity to go to 12-step programs that were free, and if I wanted to, and follow up from other clinicians if I wanted it. But I still wanted to prove that I could control my drinking. So quietly, behind the scenes, or with people who didn't know me, I would have a beer, or I would, if I'd been invited for a meal or be out somewhere, have a glass of wine. Just one of the things that I'd observed normal people would do. And what I noticed was that over the 6-8 months that followed it, which is why my clean time birthday is November rather than the March,
right?
Is I went almost certifiably insane trying to control my using, because once I did trigger the cravings with a glass of wine or a beer or two, the effort to not drink more was just monumental, and I did almost go crazy. And I remember one night being out because I was in the advertising game in those days. Being out with some people I was doing freelance work for, and they went for a drink and I went with them, and we had one drink, and somebody said, oh, well, I'll get the next round in, and somebody said, oh, I'm going to the bathroom, and I found myself standing on my own, and I suddenly realized that if I took another drink, I'd be there till midnight drinking. And somehow I walked out, and from that day on, I never drank again. I realized that one drink would trigger me into, sooner or later, I would lose that rapidly diminishing sense of control, and I would go crazy. And so I made the decision not to drink, and I attached myself to a couple of AA groups and stuck with that, and until I began to see who and what I was, and then again out of the blue, I signed up to train as an addictions counselor, and I really don't have any particular recollection of that being a carefully considered plan that I'd acted on. It just sort of, I did it. There's a story behind that, but you probably don't have the time. But I trained as a counselor, and what I discovered was that for the first time in my life, I was totally at ease in my work. And it didn't matter who walked through the door, or where they came from. And working in some of the public rehabs, they came from tough places. And they were tough people who had been battered by the world. And it was never an issue for me. I was totally at ease with it, and with the people. And I've never left the world. I've changed some of the ways in which I work and some of the places, but the nature of the work has never changed. I have various times tried to escape it into a more lucrative area of therapy, because you quite often discover that active alcoholics and drug addicts do not have a lot of money. and I will not turn people away.
Yeah.
That's the reality. So I will often carry those things. So I've never become rich in that sense, but you do not know who is going to respond. I've seen people arrive who know they've got a major problem with whatever drug or behavior it might be, and they park an Audi or a big Mercedes out the front and come in, and you'd think, and they're running big businesses and they're very capable people, and yet they cannot stop drinking, they cannot stop gambling, they cannot stop, playing with cocaine or ice or whatever is the drug that's de rigueur at that time in the surroundings. And they are utterly puzzled. And there are other people who stagger in, who've got no shoes, haven't shaved for a week, have lived under a bridge, and you don't know who it's going to be. So one of the beauties of working in this field is that you have to give every single human being who walks through the door exactly the same attention.
Yes.
Otherwise, there'd be a tendency, a danger in me with my ego to be, if I could have calculated over the years who I would be most likely to succeed with, and get my averages up so that I became famous for being the man to see, and would have made my bank balance a lot healthier. But you cannot do that with this, with these diseases. And again, there's another thing. I get so angry with people. Oh, it's not a disease. Well, diabetes and Parkinson's are two classic diseases, and the thing that connects them is that if you find out you've got diabetes or Parkinson's and you do nothing about it, you will inevitably die.
Yes.
But if you do something about it, it will not cure it, because we still have no cure for diabetes or Parkinson's. But if we get the right drugs, the right sequence, and the right treatment, we can arrest it. Then people can have a far better life than previously. It's not cured. They still will have to eat differently, take medications at particular times. And addictions are the same. Once people have crossed the line, there is no cure. But if we get it in time and we get the right treatment for that individual, which is always the challenge, then we can arrest it. And I've seen too much in 28 years to make me seriously doubt people who say that once it's cured, you can go back and drink again. I have actually never seen that.
No.
From someone who has crossed that line into alcoholism or dependency. If you've been a problematic drinker or a problematic user and you found better ways to live so you don't need those drugs and you can reduce them by sheer common sense means, wonderful, but you are not an addict.
Correct.
Once you cross that line, the only harm reduction that has any relevance is abstinence. And if you can achieving abstinence is only goal one. The next goal is, what did that drug do for you? Why did it make life so magical internally? And now you've taken it away. We now have to find a way of you making your life magical and wonderful and purposeful without a mood-altering, mind-changing chemical. And that's where the challenge lies in the work. It's largely, in some ways, luck and timing when the people are able to stop with whatever help or no help, but are able to stop. But it is very much a question of openness and skill and a comprehension of the fact that we are just, and I say just, but we are part of something much bigger.
Yes.
That this world is not just a bunch of biological, biochemical reactions which end when we reach a certain point, that there is something much bigger about this world that we live in. And, even if that proves to be incorrect, because I'm fairly sure that of all the theories that we have in all the religions and spiritual traditions, and of all the people who believe there's nothing after death, that we'll all be wrong in some way. That it'll be something that no one's ever thought of or been capable of comprehending.
I agree.
That, to me, makes it an exciting prospect rather than something that you have to defend. I don't even have to defend it.
Well, in many cases, as far as what I learned when I first came in was, quit questioning it. Don't ask why. Don't question the program. If you follow these simple suggestions, you will recover. And the more you try and understand how it works, why it works, I don't care. I got to a point in my recovery where it no longer mattered why it was working. I just knew that if I followed these simple suggestions, that my life continued to get better. And I think that your point, as far as trying to, it's funny, and there's really no way of achieving that goal that you were talking about, as far as getting your numbers up or getting your percentages up as the guy to come and talk to. 1 in 10 of us make it. And the reason why is because it's so difficult, especially when you talk about a guy who's got a BMW, a thriving business, money in his pocket. How is he going to get that gift of desperation that a guy who's lost everything walks into a room and has had every door slammed in his face
And now all of a sudden there's one door left that's open and says, this is the last house on the block, and we welcome you. Come in, please. And keep coming back.
And and if you do go out again, they just say, "Oh, where have you been? Welcome back."
Yes.
It's the closest anybody gets to saying, "I told you so."
The money problem is huge.
Yeah, one of the stories about the early, how AA developed first off was that if someone was being difficult and resistant intellectually, an old timer would give him $20 and say, "Go out and get drunk and come back when you're ready to work."
Yes.
And there's all of those things. One of the beauties today, we have to remember, or I believe we have to remember, that back in the day when the 12-step fellowships began, there was one meeting a week if you were lucky. One meeting a week. Sometimes it was less than one a week. It could have been one every 2 or 3 weeks, because there was no. Now, wherever you go in the world, there are meetings every day at any time of the day or night.
Yes.
All around the world. So, in fact, if you commit to the process, you will, if you like, recover far more quickly than if you've only got the 1 a week and there were no phone lines available. A lot of people, they were, the low bottom drunks. They had come off the streets. They didn't have landlines and cars and things like that to get around. So they got well doing it hard. Now, when here in Auckland, it's a city of only 1 million people, and there's something like 130 meetings of AA, and then there's NA and all the others. And they're available all the time. So it's inevitable that people will recover quicker. And secondly, there's far greater understanding of the psychology and the emotional nature of what goes on with these drugs, and the support systems are all over the place. I remember going to San Francisco and and I wanted to visit the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, which has a remarkable reputation all around the world. And I was asking somebody there, I said, "Oh, I know somebody who works in such and such a rehab." And he said, "Oh, I've never heard of it." And I said, "Oh." He said, "You have to remember that in one county in San Francisco, there are something like 450 rehabs." So unless you are world famous, like a Betty Ford or a Haight-Ashbury, you're not really going to know the work that's going on quietly every day with people who just quietly get on with the work, and that's what's so inspirational as well.
And to be honest with you, that's the primary purpose for doing the podcast. And because of the podcast, I've met people like you, people that are very vocal, that represent and are advocates for recovery, and have that door open, to make recovery available to everyone, that to kind of kill the stigma of being an addict or an alcoholic as something that's even worse than a disease, that is so embarrassing and it's so difficult to even utter those words. But I remember the first time I walked into a meeting devastated and beat up and lost everything, and said, "My name's Omar and I'm an addict." And I never felt so comfortable saying those words than in that moment. And that's why we're here.
I would give anything to be able to get so close to an answer that it would happen for everybody.
Yes, yes. I relate so much, especially to the resistance to change that the newcomers have, to adopt a new way of thinking. And they relapse and they relapse and they relapse. And surprisingly, they keep coming back, and you just want to shake them, and you just want to go, "Buddy, you don't have to go back out there. You don't have to go back out there." And no matter how much we want, really, truly would love to see this person recover, it's all on them.
Well, there's an American friend of mine, when I was in New York one time, said if every alcoholic that he'd met had stayed in recovery, they'd need Madison Square Garden every night of the week.
It's true. We don't have rooms in the meetings for all the people that need it.
It's a huge issue. But it's one where there is one of the fascinations to me is that there is always hope, because it could be quite crushing when you watch how societies and governments mismanage the treatment of addiction, it can become very depressing. And you see people who have been given, because in my time, I've seen suicides and people deliberately setting out to drink themselves to death.
Yes.
And lives being destroyed and children being left parentless and all of that. And that could have happened to my children. I came within an ace of that happening. So, there's so much of what happens doesn't need to happen. And we talk about the individual responsibility of the addict. And that's how AA and NA and GA work. Never mind, as a friend of mine used to say, yeah, okay, you were dropped on your head as a baby, so what are you going to do about it now? When he got sick of listening to someone whining about their childhood. And we know it's personal responsibility, but at the same time, it would be a lot swifter if we could get society as we live it to take ownership of the fact that we've made alcohol kind of a god, when in fact it was a medium of spirituality. It's no accident that alcohol is used for communion. It's no accident that marijuana and many other of the psychedelics were used by shamans to access higher worlds and higher states of thinking. That they were real. It's just that in the West we think, oh yeah, we read the book and take 3 of those and 2 of those and knock it back with some vodka and we'll get there quicker. And that ends up being a problem. Each of the sources, whether it be alcohol or anything else, there is a deep significance to them. And I believe every addict I know is on a spiritual quest. They just got sidetracked.
Yeah.
And backed into a back alley with junk and dead bodies and dumpsters. But in fact, what they had been looking for was the source. The drug gives you a caricature of what it is to feel connected. And we all know, those of us who, whatever the drug was, it gave us what we were seeking. That's why we all choose different ones, because we all have that different. But it's all about finding the source and finding a connection, finding an awareness of an expansion of the mind. And of course, the drugs mimic that, and then they take it away and destroy us. And that's the challenge, to maintain the spiritual journey without the drug.
Absolutely. All right, David, we could go on for hours. This is wonderful. Listeners, this has been a real treat. We have gotten a lot of information here, so you're going to have to probably listen to this one twice. And don't forget to pick up David's book. I know I'm going to check it out now.
It's on Amazon, on Kindle and Amazon.com. Ask Addiction Survival Kit, David Chaloner. And I've made it as cheap as nothing in particular, and it's very easy to download. It's easy to read. It points you in. I make no claims to resolve everything, but I suggest you look at everything. If you've been struggling, don't stop. There's hope.
And what's your website, David?
It's www.davidchaloner.com.
All right, guys, everything's going to be listed on the show notes, the book, the website, everything. So you'll be able to get to the website and find David and his information there. So, David, we're going to close up here, and we're going to answer some questions for the newcomer. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Number 1, what was keeping you from getting clean or staying clean when you first got introduced to recovery?
My ego. I found it very difficult to understand that I could not control something. And I came from a world where a man controlled himself and pulled himself together and fought his way through and did it. And I quite simply was unable to.
That ego is just not my amigo.
Nope.
So, all right. It's our nemesis. All right.
Yeah.
So number 2, David, at what point did you have a spiritual awakening, that aha moment in recovery when you accepted that you were powerless over drugs and alcohol, but for the first time had developed the hope that you could recover?
I think it was when I read that and I thought to myself, Christ, I'm an alcoholic. I think that was the start of it. I then tried to resist God, if you like. And it happened a couple of other times through my recovery. It hasn't all been roses and, and la dancing along like Gene Kelly and Singing in the Rain. There's mostly because of my ego. I had a huge spiritual awakening when I was in the grip of a depressive episode, of which many addicts suffer anyway. And I have worked on that, where I was actually into despair without ever thinking of going back to alcohol or drugs. But I was thinking there was no point in continuing. And in that moment, I was completely and utterly flooded with a sense of love and connection, and a voice spoke to me and said, "This is not their drama. You have work to do." And since that moment, some years ago, I have never, ever experienced depression. I have never doubted that what I'm supposed to be doing. I've sometimes doubted my capacity to do it, but there's never been any depression around that, just minor concerns about certain things. And so that took a little while, but I think that first one, that realization that even though my best efforts were to keep resisting it, in the end, resistance was futile. And when I was simply able to recognize that my willpower was insufficient, that I was going mad trying to control the cravings, until I removed any of the sources and got through the withdrawals of that, the minor withdrawals as they were, and also changed my diet to eradicate as much white sugar as possible, because that's a major trigger for cravings. When I did that, life got better and better. And the reality is today, I can go anywhere, be with anyone, not need anything, and be at ease with the people around me and my God. And I don't have to explain it.
Beautiful. I love it. I love it. All right. Number 3, do you have a favorite book you would recommend to a newcomer that you read in early recovery?
Yeah, I've got some favorite books. One that I think every human being on the planet should read is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. That's F.R. Because even in the death camps, he actually, if you read his diary, he describes what it is to be an addict. And it's a most powerful statement. He recognized in the struggle to stay alive in the death camps, sometimes they were only ever given just basic, very, very meager rations, and they were worked to death. They were only kept alive as long as they were of use. And he always knew when someone had decided to die, when they had done a day's work, and a guard, feeling kind, offered them another bowl of, they called it soup, but it was nothing more than water with bits and pieces in it, an extra bowl of soup or a cigarette. He always knew when someone had decided to die, and it was when they accepted the cigarette.
Wow.
And I have a strong thesis that when you don't know, when you come into recovery and you have no idea what's happening and that you're actually heading towards jails, institutions, and death, as they write, you don't know what's going on. But once you've had a taste of recovery and you've heard and you've understood that in fact this is a terminal illness if it's not treated, and you go back to using, it is almost an act of suicide.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's one of the things that tends to get people dilly-dally around that. But there's a truth to that when people just think, oh, to heck with it, knowing that continued alcohol use and pathological gambling, highest suicide rate of all the addictions, you make the choice to die. Man's Search for Meaning. And there is another beautiful book, if you just want an understanding which fills things in terms of science, as well as the spiritual, emotional dimensions. There's a beautiful little book by an American called Gerald May, M-A-Y, and it's called Addiction and Grace. And this was a man who was a psychiatrist until he started working with addicts and then realized his psychiatric knowledge was a waste of time and figured out that there was different ways you had to work with them. But he does, in a lovely little book, he explains the physiological, biochemical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual issues that arise in becoming addicted. And he writes very cogently. And then there's another, if you do identify as part of the Christian mystical tradition, a book that I discovered not very long ago by a Franciscan monk in America, in New Mexico, called Francis Rohr, R-O-H-R. And he wrote a book called Breathing Underwater. And what it is he read the 12 steps and went, wow. And so he's given an entire book to an expression of the 12 steps from the spiritual dimension. And he's done it beautifully.
This is gold. This is gold. Okay, guys, make sure you come to the website and check out these books. I actually did read Viktor Frankl's book. Very, very powerful book. Extremely powerful. So I also recommend that. This is great suggestions, David. Number 4, what is the best suggestion you have ever received?
The best suggestion I ever received was an old-time member of AA who, whenever I shared at a meeting, would wander past me and fire a little comment out of the corner of his mouth, which was so cryptic that I didn't understand it, but I knew that it had come from the big book, so I had to go and read the damn big book again to find out what he meant. And on this particular occasion, he came past me. I was talking to his widow wife last night, funnily enough. He's been dead 12 years now, and he was sober for 40. And he walked past me one night after I'd shared at a meeting, and he said, "About time you got in the firing line." And I thought, what are you talking about now? And I reread the big book because I knew the answer would be in there. And actually that line is in there, and it is about those people who find that they should become addiction professionals, counselors in the field. And he picked that in me when I was about 4 years sober, 3-4 years sober. And that was the man. And oddly enough, in my traveling backwards and forwards, I got things in boxes and I put things away. And I came across his little pamphlet from the funeral. And I was remembering him. And then just a few days later, I bump into his wife, who is now well into her 80s. And we had a catch up. But that was the one thing. And that to me was a very personal thing for me. But it points to how people in the fellowship listen so closely to people and can hear what's needed, and will make the suggestion. He would have made those different suggestions to other people about other things. And it's that if you go to a meeting and you listen, you will find not only the answers for yourself, but you will find at some point a way of helping the person you've been listening to. And that's the way it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, number 5, if you could give a newcomer only one suggestion, what would it be?
Don't go away. Keep coming back until you get it.
Yes, perfect. That's exactly what you need to do. Keep coming back is probably could be the number 1 suggestion that people always seem to give out. And it's so true. It's so true. No matter what, just keep coming back. Don't leave 5 minutes before the miracle.
That's it. That's a lovely phrase.
I love it. I love it. David, great suggestions. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, strength, and hope with us.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm honored to have been asked. Thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful. All right. Everybody, thanks for joining us. And as we say here in Costa Rica, pura vida.
Pura vida.
Thank you for joining us on the Share Recovery Podcast. To check out the show notes page on this interview or to thank our guests for sharing their story, go to www.thesharepodcast.com. While you're on the website, don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter to stay up to date on the latest news, podcasts, and interviews. Want to be one of our guests and share your story? Then go to our website and click on the Share Your Story button. We share our inspiring recovery stories every Tuesday, so subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher Radio to get your free weekly download. We'll see you then. The opinions shared on this show reflect those of the individual speaker and not of any 12-Step Fellowship as a whole. And though we discuss 12-Step recovery and the impact it had in our lives, we do not promote or endorse any 12-Step Anonymous program.